Speculating about the future is what NetEvents panelists and audiences enjoy the most. And this final debate of the day was no exception, as Sean Hackett of the 451 Group lined up his panel to look for a high-level view of where the industry is headed. For Merchant, the future was about three big issues: restraining costs, increasing security, and improving the end-user experience.
And I think talking in those three dimensions, as opposed to talking about, am I going to use this hypervisor or am I going to use this ISO image, I think talking in these three dimensions is going to be pretty important for a CIO.
Paul Obsitnik from Juniper looked at it from a service provider's point of view. He talked about how the motivation for cloud adoption has changed, how networking is complex but shouldn't be, and how the development of standards is helping to simplify them. He had advice for the service providers.
Because from our perspective, what I like to tell service providers, you got challenges, but you have a great opportunity. Their number one core product, the network, is in ever-increasing demand. And I think that's something that they can't lose sight of, and they shouldn't lose sight of, that it's in big demand. But there's also an opportunity as we're looking at the need for greater customization of services from the end users. There's a greater opportunity for them to drive their revenue and increase their economics that way. But fundamentally, it's going to require an agile, flexible network, and that's where a lot of what we're talking to comes into play.
If I may perhaps add a little bit to that as well, I think it's important to also understand the context of where we're coming from, right? If you look at networking as an example, the fundamental nature of networking hasn't changed in 20 years, right? It's the same. You've gone faster, you've got new protocols, but every networking device has a control plane and a data plane and their co-resident, making this a big distributed computing problem. I think that the notion of driving simplicity is fundamentally what's making the push towards SDN and NFV, right? Conceptually, that's where it's going, right? By doing that whole architectural change, I think there's an opportunity to truly simplify the whole IT operations, right? And this is not just about networking. This is actually about IT operations. And I think that's the direction. It's not going to happen in a day, in a year, right? It's a decade-long transition, but I think we're at the early stages of that transition.
So number one thing, that cloud promise a very simple topology. This is very, very important. For us, old enough, you would remember when Steve Jobs announced the digital life, when there is really a Macintosh and just have a stock architecture connecting with either iPod, all those things. It makes a previously very complex personal information management system very simple. When cloud now is playing the same role, cloud in the center, now you got this star architecture. What does that mean? Another level of simplicity comes to application development. Now the developers, instead of worrying about inter-process function calls and memory location and all those things, they make a function call to the cloud, and things can be done in that way. It's much, much simple. So you are going to see more innovations coming out from that way.
The panel was then asked to think about how the network of the future would be managed.
Yeah, that's a great question as well, right? And I think it's part of the evolution, right? Which is, as you start looking at these specialized environments focused around specialized workloads, there are multiple aspects. There's a policy aspect. There is also a visibility aspect, right? Which is you can apply policy, but once you've applied it, how do you know the policy is actually effective, right? And so I think both of those go hand in hand, right? And so I think if you look at the evolution of how clouds will eventually operate, there will be a strong networking component, right? Perhaps driven by SDN architectures, where the switching infrastructure becomes relatively simple, the intelligence is pulled out, and there'll be a separate infrastructure for the purposes of monitoring and management, right? And that'll have its own set of intelligence as well. And those two will proceed in parallel to truly provide predictability, reliability, and resiliency in these very specialized fog or cloud environments.
The distribution of the elements is critical. And as systems become more distributed, then the interconnection of the distributed parts becomes relevant. Imagine just like a circulatory system, if the human body were extended, then the circulatory system would be critical to be extended as well. That doesn't mean that it's all about the network, quite the contrary. It just means that the network is a necessary but insufficient part of making sure a distributed system operates well. That's where I think our tendency to revert to the network is the product has to end. Because at the end of the day, the difference between the services we're planning today and using today and planning for tomorrow, and the services that we planned years ago for use then, is that we have not a small number of services that are macro services to be used by all. We have microservices for communities of interest within enterprises and within consumers. So as a result, when we talk about the infrastructure to interconnected, there are a lot of similarities, but we're now fundamentally connecting very rapidly evolving communities of interest to a myriad of applications of their choice, which can fall out of favor tomorrow or take off virally tomorrow.
I think we also need to be careful. It's not a centralize everything or a decentralize everything question. It really is looking at what is the most intelligent way and having the flexibility to centralize where you need to and decentralize where you need to. Because when we talk to service providers, a great example is, I've had questions asked of me, well, does that mean with NSD and NFV, SDN and NFV, everything's going to be centralized in the data center? Well, to get to that decision presupposes that bandwidth is unlimited, has a zero cost, and a zero delay. And we know that's not the case. So some services are more logically resident in the data center. Some are going to be more logically resident at the edge. There's one large service provider in the US that's thinking about turning all of their central offices into 2,000 mini data centers. So I think fundamentally, though, I do agree we've got to drive it from the services and the policy, and the network flexibility gives us the capability to allow that intelligence to drive what the network is really doing.
The final question of the final debate on the final day from Sean Hackett was what the vendors needed to do to stimulate demand for cloud within the enterprise.
Sure. So let me take a quick crack at it. I think it's a very broad question, and it has a lot of facets to it, but I'll bring one piece of it to the table here. If you look at today, what are the kinds of applications or services that are being moved to the cloud? By and large, it's a lot of it is tier 2, tier 3 applications, right? And typically ones that don't require an SLA. It's because the cloud doesn't provide any SLAs today, right? And I think what will really drive demand is when you can start taking a tier 1 applications, move it into the cloud, and get a fixed SLA, right? Now, what does it take to get there? I think the key piece that's missing today is visibility. You can go up to Amazon Web Services, slide your credit card, say I need 20 virtual machines, X amount of memory, X amount of CPU, it's done. But can you also slide your card and say, I want visibility to these 5 applications, and I want to know exactly what's happening with these 5 applications? No, you can't, right? And I think being able to deliver that kind of visibility is going to be a key enabler for broader acceptance of the cloud for tier 1 applications.
For Merchant, the issue was visibility into the network, while Obsitnik said that human issues, performance and security were key. Kandikar said that it was all about trust and confidence, while Zhang said that there were 2 elements, fear of failure and rewards for success. And with that, the debate drew to a close the plenary element of this NetEvents Press and Analyst Summit.